Welcome back, welcome back, welcome back to the Scoop. Remember, here on the VET S.O.S. podcast, you do not have to drown in the sea of transition. You grab that VET S.O.S. Lifeline, because we're here to help. Whew. And just when you thought that we was done, just when you thought that it was quiet over here, we've been behind the scenes. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, especially the information you're going to get today is going to be a game changer. And if you're going to be listening to this in 2026, this will set you up for the next 15, 20, 30 years for the younger generation, for generations and generations to come. If you just pay attention and just lock in with some of the things that Jeff is going to be sharing with us today, it's going to take you to the next level. But you're wondering what I'm talking about. Don't worry, I'm here to share. So you're about to meet the financial game changer that you didn't even know that you need. Jeffrey Panik. He said, I said, how do you pronounce your last name? He said, like panic, like your panic. Don't worry. Financial Panic, we got you covered. So Jeff is not just the author of Your Future Is Now. This is what we're going to talk about today. He's a mission-first financial educator who's flipping the script of what it means to lead with your wallet and your wisdom, with a background rooted in financial planning and a passion for helping veterans, students, and emerging leaders navigate life's financial minefield. Jeffrey isn't here to just talk about money. He is here to unlock your financial purpose. So buckle up, strap in, because today's episode is going to be fire. We're breaking down budgets. We're going to be crushing some credit myths, and we're going to be building bulletproof money moves. Say that 3 times fast. Bulletproof money moves with the man who makes your dollars make sense. So welcome to the Scoop. Jeff, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. I don't know if I can live up to that, though. I need a couple of seatbelts after that.
You know, I call it living up because you're here and you're about to share what's between the front page and the back page of your book. So before we even start, I know the scoop on you, but what's so the audience that's listening in, so the audience is going to find this podcast, what's the scoop on Jeff?
Yeah, so the scoop is, and the reason why I wrote the book, I kind of look at my background, and I wrote it mainly for someone that was in a similar situation. I got out of high school, went into college, first person to go into college in my family. Didn't really know what in the world I was doing or what I wanted to do. I had probably a lot more fun than I should have. Ended up getting a letter from Sally Mae about 6 months before I was about to graduate. Sally Mae, I thought it was a magazine subscription service or something. It's, a loan servicer that was saying, you need to start paying us back, saying that I owed about $1,000 a month for the next 10 years and didn't really have any skills, didn't know what I wanted to do. And came across a program the Army had where it was a loan repayment program. You go in for your service and they pay your loans off. So went through the program, learned probably about 3 times as much as I did in the military than what I did in college. And after college, after the military, I ended up going in the financial advisory world, which I've been in for about 25 or 26 years. Kind of learned from my background experiences and doing it 25 or 26 years, you see a little bit of everything. And so what I've tried to do is put together a couple books. The book that we're talking about today is for young adults, really to try to help really use as a reference or a blueprint for someone that just needs help. And there, isn't a whole lot of guides out there. High school, they do a very terrible job educating kids on consumer finance. They're focused on calculus, algebra, in a lot of ways, things that people don't usually use every day. And so really want to use the book as a reference and really a blueprint for someone that just needs help cutting through all the noise.
Right. And we talk about cutting through all the noise. So you started, and I like to always discuss, so how do we get to the title? So your title says The Future, and now is in big, bold print. Because when I was a young adult, I'm like a mid-age adult now, but when I was a young adult, my thing is like, oh, I got forever. I'll do it tomorrow. Yeah. I'm young. But you have it highlighted in bold now. Yep. Do it now. Your future is now. Get financially stable now. Why did you, or how did you come up with this book where you have on one side, you have everything that, that a young adult goes through. So you talk about healthcare, taxes, car loans, mortgages, credit cards, student loans. And then sitting here on a seesaw is the individual trying to I look at wow, look what I'm gonna do to repay all this. I'm only 20, 23, 24 years old. I just did maybe one tour in the military, maybe even two, or like you say, you're a young adult, you finish in college, now you're about to start what they say adulting, right? So
Yes,
how
yes.
did you come around to the cover of the book?
Yeah, so really, I mean, I look at a lot of young people and adults for that matter, and it's very easy to get overwhelmed very quickly. And so, looking at, whether, as you mentioned, all the different pieces, it's easy to go down the wrong road. And really, the reason for your future is now is really there's no need for procrastination. That's really the devil or the enemy. Because what ends up happening is if you procrastinate with your loans or with debt, it just continues to grow and spiral. And every dollar that you pay the bank or a credit card company is one that you could be using for your savings or for your life. And so, the making sound decisions often can be difficult because there's just not a good, I've said Google and the internet are great, but the problem is you get 300 million search hits, and it's really how do you get through all the noise and people trying to sponsor to sell you something. And so really the point of the cover is really with most people it's a bit overwhelming. There's a lot of financial jargon, and you end up with all these things and how best to manage it. And it's not all at one time. Often, you usually start with the student loans, credit cards, and if you don't have the loans, great. Really, it's a matter of trying to get the most out of the money that you have at the end of the day. And one of the biggest things that I focus on is budgeting, really as a central foundation.
Central foundation, because as you know, a central foundation is I call it the cornerstone.
Yeah.
That's how you start
Yeah.
off the chapter, right? You said
Yep.
before you even dive into the book or even start, and let's start out the foundation as establishing the budget. How do you create a budget? So what's some of the things that you would share with somebody that's transitioning or somebody that's starting out on a new journey as that chapter one of your book, how to create a budget?
Yeah, so it's like kind of doing a packing list in the military or doing anything that you do. You want to have a checklist, or you want to go through and you just want to make sure that you're just not missing things as you go. And you want to take an inventory of everything, where you're starting from, your starting point. And then you want to try things out. There's all kinds of different budgeting strategies. Really, you want to try a few different ones. And what I've seen in certain situations, sometimes individuals get so focused on one and they're just not comfortable with it. You want to find something that you can develop into a habit, a budget that works and that works with you and that you're comfortable doing on an ongoing basis. And really by doing that, you're really able to find, what your income is, what your expenses are, and, try to better control the money going out the door and putting it more in your pocket.
Right. So, what's some of the things that you would share? You said to control the money coming in and not going out, especially as a young adult is trying to figure out, they have housing, they have maybe a car note. What is your recommendation of percentage that they should at least put aside to start building that nest egg or start building the future?
Yeah, and it's like a lot of things. There's not a, they have people that say, "What's my number?" or "How much should I be saving? What percentage?" Really, it's a matter of what do you have in debt. If it's reality. If you want to save 20%,
Right.
year or 20% of your income. Well, do you have other debt? Because you probably can't do that in the first place. But if you're paying 18 or 20% on a credit card, that's really the first thing that you should attack. The other thing I always say, it's important really to see what your benefits are through your employer. I mean, if you have a match through your 401k, 403b, your retirement plan, you want to take care of that first and fund that because that's your employer matching what you're contributing. And it's really, I view it as really free money once you get past the amount of time you have to stay at the employer to be vested. And so, really, after that, you really want to start looking and seeing where the best place to put the money. And the other part of the budget's the foundation, but the other foundation is really the rainy day fund or the emergency fund. And what gets
Right.
people into trouble often is they just don't have money set aside. Very few people have savings these days, unfortunately. And oftentimes, whether it's a medical expense, whether it's a car, where you have a blown tire, that's a good way where you can rack debt up. And really, it's a matter of having the emergency fund with funds available to take care of that, and doing it in a fashion where you understand the amount and where it's going.
And speaking of the amount and where it's going, what is one of the biggest misconception about credit that you would like to debunk? Because I know, like, these some credit cards are 15, 20,
Right.
30%.
Yes.
Like what's some of the
Yeah,
things that
so, it's like you always wanna be mindful of the teaser rate, whether it's a
mm,
0% rate or whether, what the offer is. They're gonna give you something. The reason why they're giving you something is more than likely they're trying to get something out of you down the road. We always say there's nothing free, and that's really the case with the credit card companies, and it's unfortunate if I look at even on college campuses, if you go around a library, you have no trouble finding the credit card offers scattered about and people trying to sell you debt. And so, as opposed to talking about savings, it's the other side where the debt, and once you can't manage debt and once you accumulate debt, it really is the opposite of compounding, we say. Compounding is the longer you have, the more money you put in, the more you're going to earn interest on interest. Well, this is the reverse. You're paying the card companies, not paying yourself.
and that's where a manager debt is like paying the car companies and not paying yourself, and that's what one of the strategies that I shared with some of my young adults is there's the difference between the credit card close date and the pay by date. If you could kind of share about that, because I know a lot of people get that confused. I was like, as long as you know pay
Yeah.
your balance in full, so it does not incur interest, and then you as long as you line up those days, you can have an extra amount of days to get it taken care of.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, you always wanna pay any, in ideally speaking, you always wanna pay your credit card in full every month. That goes a long way to raising your credit score and not having debt. Obviously, if you're doing that, sometimes that's easier said than done. If you, like I mentioned before, if you have a lot of times emergencies come up, that is usually, if you don't have the savings, that's where the money has to come from. And so it's really a matter of, once you have that, really not to make the minimum payments. It's like the example of, you have student loans. Well, they have a repayment plan where you can stretch out an extra 10 years. Well, guess what? By doing that, you're probably paying about 8 extra years of interest, because of
Right.
just the way the structure of these student loan programs are. And so, whether it's credit cards, student loans, I mean, medical debt, unfortunately, is one of the largest debt components these days for people that are carrying debt. And, a lot of it in some ways could be avoided if you're better educated, even with the health plan that you have, and how to,
Mhm.
even how to manage it. And that's not taught in school. And that's really there, there's no, it's taught through life and hard life lessons. And really, what I've tried to do with the book is make it so that it can be used, as I mentioned before, as a reference, where, if you have an issue with your car and you realize you have to buy another one, and you're thinking about buying or leasing or how you get a loan or how you do all these things, there's a chapter that covers that, that can help you
Mhm.
try to work through that. Because it's easy, with cars, with all these things, with big ticket items, most people that are younger aren't used to purchasing. It's very easy to
Right.
make a simple mistake, and then it's something that it takes a long time often to try to work around that, or try to get through that onto the other side.
And definitely talk about the other side is about the banking system, right? Because you
Uh,
have I tell people to say you have a bank, you have a credit union, you
yeah,
have
yeah,
when we was younger, we used to call it susu, in the Caribbean family, it's like, hey, everybody chip in and then we go around and it's payout. So it's different banking systems, but what is some of your advice about taking advantage and what do most people overlook when it comes to choosing banks?
yeah. So I think the one thing that you always want to overlook, you want something that's convenient, that you feel comfortable with. You don't want to pick a bank if you're going to be moving across the country. You want
Right.
to, you want to always have, and if you can have a relationship, that's great. That's easier said than done these days. And really, you want to understand what the need is. If you have a business, you're going to be depositing, moving money. It's important to understand what the cost and the fees are. That's regardless across the board. Really, you want to
Mhm.
understand. And in a lot of cases, whether someone's starting out or even someone older, you can find an optimal account where you're not paying a 30 or $40 monthly fee. So, obviously getting back to minimizing what the fees are, if you can save 30 or $40 a month, that can go into savings. And while it doesn't sound that much in 1 year, if you take that over 15 or 20 years, it's pretty significant. And the other thing would be, just don't give the money to the bank where they can just loan it out. Once you reach a certain, what I would say, your operating account that you're comfortable with, which would be your checking, you want to set up a high yield savings account where you can earn, interest, reasonable interest on, and have your money that you're, the rainy day money, the emergency fund, if you want to take a vacation, the different things that line up, really having that there for that purpose.
And one of the things that I know that it comes around is the April time frame is is
Yeah.
when that T word comes, the taxes. Like, one of the things I learned as navigating through this, as we talked about earlier, right, the financial
Yeah.
minefield is you really don't have to wait to the April date to do your taxes. You could do it monthly, you could do it quarterly, to make it less intimidating. That's one of the things I wanted to ask. Like, what's one thing that every young adult should understand about getting money back, especially when they look at filing taxes?
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, I think one of the things that, you're getting a refund. Well, you're giving the money to the government and they're paying you back what they owe you. So it's not like they're doing you any favors, would be the main thing. Really understanding. And most of this, if it gets back to the financial jargon and trying to understand, you don't have to be an expert in it. Really, it's a matter of just trying to make it work for you, which I think has been really lost. And sometimes if you try to understand things to the point of just understanding everything, you just get lost in that one thing. Really, it's a matter of making it manageable and making it so that you can make all the different pieces work for you, whether it's savings, whether it's a credit cards, whether it's your retirement, your debt. It really making it so that you understand and you have a working understanding of it, but you're not to the point where you're so focused on one area that you forget everything else.
And one of the things that we usually forget is insurance, right? Like we talked about before we went live, is
Yeah.
when you're young, you feel so invincible. Like, oh,
Yes.
I don't
Yeah.
need insurance.
Or
I'll worry
more
about that
free.
later when I get older. What's one of the things that one thing that was shared with me when I was younger, I was coming through the military is, hey, get a policy now because you're healthy now, right? So once they
Yeah.
go through all the rigorous tests and stuff, they get you locked in, and that way your rate could stay low instead of waiting 15, 20 years to get that policy, then it's going to be a little bit higher. So what's one of the things that trying to understand about healthcare and how critical it is for that, that transition is growing up in adulthood?
Yeah, I mean, I think really you look at it, whether it's a term policy, which is kind of like temporary, or a permanent policy for life. It's important to get it early so that you have it in place, especially if you have children, if you have a family. I was raised by a single mother because my father passed away when I was an infant and didn't have any insurance, and so I understand what the consequences of it. It becomes a constant struggle without having that money there in case there's an emergency. And the younger you are, you can get a lot more what we call leverage on the insurance coverage. And so, really, the earlier you start, the better on that end. The other side is even, I talk about an umbrella policy, really with liability. If you drive around most parts of the country, every other billboard is an attorney, which is trying to get after someone. And so really liability is the other thing. You want to make sure that if you're putting all this money away in savings and you're doing the right thing, you don't have an accident or there isn't something that happens at your house or apartment that creates a cascade of issues where, it all is gone because of the liability of someone suing you.
And one of the things that we also, you just talk about the highway, seeing the billboards and stuff, and
Yeah.
that's where in the book you talk about vehicles, right? That's, I know, as a young person, you want the fastest car,
Yeah.
you want
Yeah.
the highest lifted truck,
Yeah.
and and in the book you talk about, okay, do you need a car or do you want one? Well, we have to figure that out first before I could, advise you which direction you should go. So you want to kind of give us the
I
scoop on
I
that?
mean, I'll use a good example. If you're thinking about you're getting out of the military and you're thinking about doing contract work, it's probably not a good idea to have a sports car. So you want to have the vehicle fit your life. Especially another example would be, if you have a Dodge Charger and you're driving, 60 miles a day, probably, it's probably going to burn through gas. So you want to look at all the pieces, and then you look inside of the car. What are the pieces of the car that are just probably push the price up that you may not need? It's like the massage chair. They have all these things.
Right.
Heated, cold seat, all these things. Do you really need all of that? And if you can afford it, great. But maybe you can use that money that you're paying monthly for that actual added item. You can put it into savings or pay down other debt.
And that's huge because we talk in the book. You also talk about the adult protection, like somebody coming fresh out of college, fresh out of the military, or fresh out of like just they got their first job and now they moving into to their real job, right?
Yeah.
They had a starter job and now this is the job I want. Like, what are some of the things that you want to say? Like, hey, these are some of the things you probably need to start protecting yourself moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, really what you want to do is you want to understand that a lot of times people will talk about the health savings accounts, the flexible spending accounts,
Mm,
and the type of coverage that you have through your employer. You want to make sure you have someone that can help you typically a benefits manager, pick the right coverage for you. Because what happens a lot of times, so, it's human nature. You typically will pick the least inexpensive coverage, and so what ends up happening in certain situations, if you have health issues, that's not going to work very well for you, and then you're going to end up having to pay a bunch of deductibles and all these other things when you could have been maybe a little bit more covered. And the other side of it as well is on the savings side, just having a basic understanding of what if you work for an employer, what your retirement plan is, what you can put into it, whether it has a Roth option, which is, down the road, it could be potentially tax free.
right.
What makes the most sense there? And typically with most employers, there's an infrastructure where they have people to help with that. So I think, a lot of times it's easy to get overwhelmed, and that's why kind of your future is now. The other thing is it's not bad to ask for help either. That's, I think, one of the biggest life lessons, especially if you're a young adult. A lot of times you can find people at the company that are in, especially HR and benefits, that are really there to help. I mean, that's what their job is. It's the hardest thing for most people is really just to take a first step and ask for help.
Right, and asking for help as being a quarter of a century in a profession. You talk about in the book 15 financial tips.
Yes.
My question, what's the scoop, or what do you personally? Because what people say, like, hey, if the financial guy is doing these things, I want to do the same thing, right? Because he's not gonna
Yeah.
stay himself wrong. So,
Yeah.
what are some of the tips that you use that you talk about in the book, of your financial tips that you
Yeah.
use currently that helps you stay above water?
Yeah, so there's 15. I look at 15 foundational tips really to raise, whether you start thinking about having children or you have children. Really, I have like 15 tips in there really to kind of work through. And I think a couple of the biggest ones would be one, college planning doesn't start when they're juniors or seniors in high school, because at that
Yes.
point they're going to pick where they want to go already. And you're going to be sitting there saying, well, if you can go to community college or you can go to the state school, and it's, a quarter of the price or less, I just don't think we should pay for it. We're not going to pay for it. Well, they have it all on their mind what they're going to do. So, the sooner that you can start talking about what they want to do, it doesn't have to be exact. And the earlier you can talk about colleges and community colleges and really what they want to do, you can pair it up. And the other example that I always use, I had someone a long time ago where, they wanted to be a nurse, and so that's what they always wanted to do growing up. Well, their parent was they thought about it and they said, "Well, why don't you go do an internship or a they had a program where you could go volunteer." And so she went to volunteer and she realized she didn't like blood. And so obviously the two didn't really work together. So, by getting volunteer opportunities, internships before you really go down the road of doing a major where you're picking classes that are specific to that specialty, it's important to understand that you actually want to do it. Because if you don't want to do it and you're spending all this money, that's just money out the window. The other thing that I see these days, especially around the holidays or when the kids are around, when you're around family, adults, younger people, it's like the digital overload. If you're sitting around, whether it's any time of holiday, people are on their phones and they're in their world, especially the younger people. And what I try to do in my own life is say we're going to put down the devices and we're just going to spend some time. And one of the best ways to do it is, I mean, I like life, the game of life, Monopoly.
Yes.
But in particular, the game of life is great because it really outlines the different ways that you can go in life, and you can talk about it. And really, that gets into, I guess, one of the other things. Part of the biggest thing is uh, to let them know that it's okay to make mistakes. I think sometimes, the kids, especially if they look up to you, they get so focused on not disappointing you that sometimes something that could be a minor mistake ends up being a whole lot worse because they're afraid to tell you. And so, really, it's a matter of just talking to them about it and telling them some of the mistakes that you made. Because sometimes, if they understand that you're human, it makes them a lot easier. It makes it a lot easier for them really to own up to things and be honest about whatever their situation or whatever mistakes they've made.
One of the things I definitely want to circle back on is you made a great point. Is consider, especially if you have kids growing up about, in high school, and then they looking at to go to these big time colleges. Like, hey, let's go to junior college first, right? Like you said, let's get the lower level classes out the way.
Yeah.
We'll save 30, forty
Yes.
percent on tuition, and then we could transfer into the big college you want. You see what I'm saying? So that's a lot of things that people don't understand,
No,
that
no question.
that's an option.
No question. I mean, if you can get into something where you get comfortable with it, you do the basics, and then you can roll into something that is what you want to do. That is the optimal situation. And I think people are so focused on college, they forget about technical school and trade schools. I mean,
Yes.
the amount of opportunities in that area, it's just tremendous. And the amount of leverage you have in that profession is just, I think, huge. And I've always said, if you learn a trade, you can always go to college in the evenings or part time. And in a lot of cases, the trade company will pay for it. So I think
Yes.
the more that you can use other people's money in a case where they're giving it to you because they're trying, for education purposes, as an example, better. And the less that you have to use student loans, or I see a lot of times parents, taking parent plus loans out for their
Mm,
kids so that their kids go to school, but then they end up having the debt. And unfortunately, baby boomer, people in their 60s, they have student loans through not their own, but through a lot of times their own children. And you have to focus at some level on yourself, but at the same time, you have to focus on, if you can teach them certain lessons and you can teach them over time, just in pieces, it goes a lot better than to sit down and say, well, this is where you want to go to college. You can't do it. It's not going to work. This is where you have to go. It's more of a kind of an open conversation works typically better, but that doesn't start when they're 17 or 18, when they're ready to leave. It starts when they're, 11 or 12, thinking
right.
about where they want to go and what they want to do.
And that's when I picked up the book. For our listeners who just popping in, we're talking today to Jeff Panik. He is the author of Your Future Is Now, an introductory guide to managing your finances. So usually when I get books, I thumb through it, because my memory is wired a certain way. So I have to go through it. I read, and I kind of do a skim first, and I look at stuff that pops out to me that will, my brain resonates with it. And I highlight it and I write it down. So when I have Jeff on, I'm gonna ask him these questions, because these are the things I pulled from the book. One of the things that you talked about in the book is, like you said, your bank account isn't just about dollars. It's about decisions.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, and it really comes down to where you're spending the money. And so I use a good example of, you're hard pressed on a daily basis not to get a new subscription service because it's like, I don't even know, like, it's Peacock, Parrot, you can go down the list. It's like what every single, and so what I see a lot of times, I use the example of, at some point, if you're a young adult, typically you're going to merge households with someone else. And when you do that, there's a great likelihood that they probably have things that you both can save, and there's synergies. So in particular, when there's a marriage, it's in particular important to go through your finances and see where you can save and get leverage from the relationship from a monetary standpoint, in terms of, just, you don't need two Amazon Prime subscriptions. You don't
Right.
need two Netflix. Really, it's a matter of having one and having it kind of work for you. And then going back and saying, well, what are some things that the biggest thing to do is look in your bank account and say, well, what is this? Go through the charges, at least monthly. It's a good idea to go in there weekly just to make sure there's nothing that looks out of the ordinary. Because if you do see something that's fraudulent, the sooner that you catch it, the easier it is to kind of fix and get it removed. But I really, for most people, just suggest looking at what you use, seeing what you can save, and then saying, well, whatever that monthly, they're good about a monthly charge of 12, 15, $20. Well, what is that over a year? What is
Right.
that amount over 10 years? What would that do for you if you could put it into a Roth IRA, or put it towards your retirement, or put it towards, some sort of goal? That's the other thing. It's important that you develop goals, understanding what the cost of those goals are going to be, and then developing a plan to reach the goal.
And one of the things you also said, like I said, all these quotes that I pulled out of the book, it resonated with me, right? So the other thing I pulled out the book, you said student loans don't define your future, but your plan for them might.
Yes. And that is, I believe, the case, because, it's, unfortunately, it's easier just to defer them and just think about it later. But the longer that you do that, especially if you're not getting any sort of interest deferral, you're just adding to the amount of time that you have to pay it off over time. So it's like a mortgage. A lot of things, the shorter that you can make the repayment, the better off you are, because that's less interest that is going to the company that's lending you the money, and more money that you'll have after the fact to save or do something else with, or complete another goal.
Yeah. And one thing I was scared about when I was younger is about being in debt. So when I came across this one, debt is a tool, misuse, it's a weapon, master, it's leverage.
Yeah.
So when I seen that, I was thinking about the young kings when I was going through and like, well, and that's why, I use my credit cards for certain things. I have a credit card for fuel. I have a credit card for if I go out dining. I have, credit cards for certain things.
Yeah, and that's really, really the point. They will either they will take control of your life if you let them, or you can use them for a lot of leverage in life. And I'm not a believer that you should never have debt. I don't think in the world we're in now is it's even remotely realistic to say that, given housing prices and
Right.
given what vehicles cost. That may have been easy 30 years ago, but due to the devil that I would like to call inflation, it ends up being a situation where you a lot of times you have to have debt in order to afford things in life. But you really, when you're before you or in the process of getting or accumulating the debt, when you actually sign the documents, it's important to have a plan in place of how you're going to pay that off, and really what effect it's going to have on your monthly budget and your monthly income and expenses.
And definitely your monthly. When I was and when I was going through your book, I was laughing. I was like, man, why I didn't know this when I was younger, but I'm glad I know it now, and I'm glad that you're here sharing it for the young adults that's gonna be listening, because I didn't realize how impactful a credit score
Mhm,
was.
mhm.
So for me, when I went to go purchase my house, yes, they say, okay, this is your income, but first thing you could get credit, or you could get a nice size house if you have a great credit score, right? Because your credit worthiness, or your credit value to you repaying the loan is going to
Yes.
get your, open to other doors. So that's one of the things that I highlighted. I highlighted in three different highlights. Like, your credit score is your adult report card. And
Yeah.
yes, it matters.
Yeah, and it's, it's almost like, the equations and percentages they use, it's almost like mystical to try to figure out. I mean, they've been more transparent about it recently, but it's like, there's three different agencies: TransUnion, Equifax, and Experian. Most people have heard of one or all three, but it gets very confusing from there just about how you manage your credit to increase your score. Nothing is usually as easy as it appears. Some people think, well, if I have the cards, if I just pay them all off and close them, my score is going to go up. Well, not necessarily. It's really a matter of understanding how you can use debt to your benefit without being overwhelmed by it, and letting it take control of you, because a lot of times that's what unfortunately happens. Especially, I look at the medical debt. That's a big layer of cost that wasn't there years ago. And it everyone only has a set amount of money and a budget of income coming in typically. And so if their expenses go up by 1,000, $2,000 or $3,000 in a month, it can just throw you haywire. So, really, it's just a matter of working over time. And unfortunately, I think there's only about 22 of the states have financial literacy programs in place, and a lot of them have waivers where you could get a waiver and not even take the class. I would argue it's probably the most important thing or most important class in high school that you could take if it's available, because it teaches you a lot. It could teach you a lot of these lessons that you, and a lot of times, learn because of making mistakes.
And one of the mistakes I made when I was a young adult was when I used to get my direct deposit and I used to leave it in the checking account,
Yeah.
right? And my financial advisor like, why are you leaving it in your checking account? That's the worst thing you could do because you're not gaining interest. You're getting pennies on the dollar. One of the things that you have that I highlighted in the book also, you said, stop letting your bank profit from your ignorance. I was like, and I was laughing because I said, yep, that's the young kings. Like I just had it in the checking
Yeah.
account and I didn't move nothing around.
No, and really with most people, once you have a pretty set idea of what your monthly expenses are, when you have a surplus coming in, I mentioned the high yield savings account
Yeah.
before. Really, it's a matter of whether it's on your payday, just get that money, the money you don't need, out of the account, because a lot of times, as you like life is, it'll have a way of getting spent. But if you have it set up where it's systematic, it's almost like you're not thinking about it. That money is there, it's out of sight, out of mind, but it's available if you need it in an emergency. And that is, I think, the key, where, because what ends up happening is you have money coming in, but then as the month goes by, or the couple weeks or week, however you get paid, there's just different, whether it's life, you go somewhere and you spend money because it's in the account. It creates maybe too much comfort, and you can just get that money out there and be working on more of a hard budget where you understand where everything is going. You'll be less likely to just do a splurge, if you will. So it's not bad to splurge if you know that it's coming. It's another
Right.
thing when you just do it out of the blue.
And out the blue, another one of your fine knowledge shares that you have in the book is if you don't understand where your tax dollars go, you're paying a blindfold tax.
Yeah, I
What's
mean,
the scoop on that?
yeah, so I mean, you really want to understand. I use the example. Most people figure it out pretty quickly when they get their first job. They say, "Well,
Uh-huh.
I'm getting $10 an hour. I've worked 10 hours. I'm going to end up with $100." Well, they're like, "Well, there's FICA, there's all these things."
That
Like,
old
where
FICA.
if I end up with $65 out of 100, like, where is it going? And really, it's a matter of understanding where the money is going and then kind of working from there, especially with taxes. It's even more important if you're getting out of the military and you think you might do something where you're going to become self-employed. That's
Uh-huh.
really, you need to focus on, putting money away. You have money coming in, but you need to do withholding and do things so that you don't get a surprise in April where you just have to come out of pocket thousands of dollars because you didn't save, you didn't put enough money away or pay the government, because they're going to get paid, whether, they're going to get paid. Let's just put
Oh
it
yeah.
that way.
Yeah, they're gonna get it one way or another. So
Correct. Yeah.
yeah, and one thing you did mention, we talked about it earlier, was health, right? You said health isn't guaranteed, but financial preparation for it can be. So it's like you could prepare, like you said, get your policy early when you're younger, when you're healthy, the less thing you have to do so that over time can build up, you know.
Even disability is an example where, if you can get that early on, it's typically gonna be less
Mm,
expensive, and, that is a big risk. You put all this money away, but something happens, you become disabled, say 10 years before you thought you're gonna retire. Well, where do you come up with that deficit? Social Security disability doesn't pay enough for most people to, get them to where they need to be in a position where they're not,
mm,
in a lot of trouble financially. So, really lining up things early allows you really to kind of sit back in the future without having to sit there and worry about procrastination, and really the sooner that you can get a handle. And like I said, the biggest thing is understand you don't have to be an expert. You don't have to
mhm.
understand all the financial jargon. You just have it work for you and understand the pieces that are yours and not get so focused on just understanding every specific detail.
And one of the details I tell young individuals, I say, hey, you could get the charger, maybe get it,
Yeah,
later on in life when
yeah,
you're settled in. Because one thing that we did touch on earlier, and I'm gonna circle the block and talk about it again, is that car payment.
yeah,
It could be a financial quicksand, like you said in
yeah.
the book, right? But disguise as street, like, oh hey, yeah, get the car, you could get hit, but how does it align? Do you need a 600 horsepower car when the speed limit around where you're at is 35 miles an hour? you
Exactly.
know?
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, sometimes people will just pay, they'll say, I'm going to put 30, 40% down when they have all this other credit card debt. You want to make sure you understand what you're putting down and you want to shop it really, when you're getting a car loan, just like a mortgage, you want to go to the credit union, you want to go to the bank, you want to see who, if you're buying a Toyota or you're buying a GMC, you want to see what credit offers they have. And you want to be careful about extending it too far out where you're just paying a bunch of the more you can
Mm,
kind of squeeze it in, the less interest you're going to have to pay over time. The payments may be more, but if you can get that paid off faster, you'll be able
mhm.
to use that payment for something else when it's paid off.
And what you talk about, and the last two that I have jotted down are gold. So if you have a pen and paper, for our new tech humans out there, pull out your iPad or your phone and pull out your notepad or your digital thing. Write this down. You are your first line of defense. Financial maturity is your shield. That's what's in the book, right?
Uh-huh.
And these are some of the gems that Jeff dropped in the book for you to kind of take and kind of soak on and ponder on that. So you said maturity is your shield. Financial maturity.
Yeah, financial maturity, and I compare it to like a marathon, where there's certain people, everybody comes out kind of the same, but not really. There are people where their families are very financial literate, where they teach them lessons early on. They work with them, they even give them resources, So in a lot of cases, they may be at mile 6 or mile 7 of the
Right.
marathon. Then you have people that start out, they're just standing there, the gun goes off, and you're like, "What do I even do?" That was me. When I was starting out, I was like, "I don't even know, what am I don't even know how to be an adult." I'm still working on being, getting through, your early 20s. You're trying to figure out where you even are at that
Mm,
in life. And so really it's a matter of if you don't have that person, that's a family member, really trying to find a mentor. That's what I always suggest, especially in the military. There's people that have made every mistake imaginable, and they're there to try to help you not make the same mistakes. So that gets back into communication. Communication is central, whether it's a parent, a parent child, a spouse, any type of relationship, employee employer. Communication is fundamental because if you don't have open communication, if you're not trying to work to some goal, whatever it is, whether it's retirement, whether it's paying down debt, you have to have someone there to help you. And really, I would also call it like almost like an accountability partner, someone that will make not always the easiest decisions, tough decisions, but ones that will benefit you down the road.
and one of the things that has benefited me, and Now that I know that a certified financial advisor put it in the book, I highlight it, says financial freedom isn't a destination. It's the way you walk every day. I'm put every single day. You have in there every day. I put every single day. That's
Yeah.
it's not a destination because it to me it's like it's a lifelong journey, right? A
Mhm.
destination I
Right.
think of is you get there, okay, it's over. Let me do no. It's a lifelong journey.
Yeah, there's no question. I mean, we call it like life's curveballs. It's like, there's no shortage of you could have this perfect picture of what's going to happen in your life. And it ends up in most cases being, probably the opposite. Life is messy, life is challenging. It's just not, it's one of those things where it's all about perseverance and about learning from your mistakes and working forward. And unfortunately, it's very easy to get caught up in the past, what mistakes that you made, that doesn't change, and that doesn't change what your future could be. Your future is based upon taking steps and action, and I think that's what really separates, people that are successful in life is really being able to take action. Not always right, but really learning, getting up off the mat. Failure is probably the biggest life lesson that you can benefit from.
And you just hit as they say, the nail on the head. Taking action. And how do we take action? Because the future is now. So how do they get a copy of the book? How do they get in touch with you, your company, your website?
Right.
Because I know for a fact, FACT, that this information in the book will definitely help somebody in their financial struggles.
Yeah, so the book is on Amazon. It's Barnes Noble, where all books are sold. I also have on my website jeffreypanik.com. I have a free book download. So the first book I have is free book download. You just put your name in there and your email, and it will download the book. I think it's an important resource, and I believe in it. Also, a portion of the proceeds go to Canines for Warriors. That's a group that works with veterans that are at risk and that pairs them up with service or rescue dogs. And the benefit of the animals are they find them at shelters and they train them for the veterans. And so, I believe in that strongly. I also believe in the fact that if you can learn at least a little bit from the book, you'll be further ahead in the end.
And this is what we definitely talk about here at the VET SOS podcast. When we truly mean you do not have to drown and to see a transition from the military, transition from, excuse me, college, life, future is now. Get it, lock in, like, share, subscribe. Until next time, we're gonna have Jeff is coming back for his other book. So I'm telling, I already said, hey, we're gonna
Perfect.
have to do this in two
I'll
separate
have I'll
recordings
have, I'll have
because
3 or 4 seatbelts on for that one, right?
we going full throttle afterburners. We pulling 6, 7, 8, 9 G's straight up in the atmosphere.
Oh my goodness.
We're going full throttle. So I want to thank you, Jeff, on behalf of the listeners, on behalf of the viewers, and on behalf of every human being that's trying to navigate through the financial battlefield. So thank you,
No, thank you
thank
for
you,
having me.
thank you. Until next time, everybody, take care. Peace.